Welcome to the deep dive. If you've ever opened a copy of Grey's Anatomy, you know it's an Everest of foundational knowledge.
It really is.
And today, we're tackling one of its most dense chapters, the female reproductive system.
It's foundational for sure, but it's also where static structure meets just incredible dynamic function.
Right.
So our mission today is to take this huge survey. I mean, it covers everything from the external structures, the vascular supply, the innervation, all the way to pregnancy, and give you a clear three-dimensional mental map.
Exactly. We're not just reading a textbook here. We need to help you visualize these complex relationships. Where does the nerve actually go? Where does that artery cross?
How are these organs held in place?
Yes. So to start, let's break the system down maybe into two major areas, the external structures and then the internal organs.
That's the way to do it. Let's start with the external anatomy, the vulva, or pudendum. This region includes everything you can see externally.
So the mons pubis, labia majora, and minora, the clitoris.
And the vestibule, that central space, which houses some really key glands.
I've always found the connective tissue layers here just fascinating. The labia majora, for instance, there's so much more than just folds of skin.
They are. And they're a powerful reminder of anatomical continuity. Deep inside the labia majora, you have this dense, membranous layer, causus fascia.
Okay.
And this layer is a direct continuation of Scarpa's fascia from the anterior abdominal wall. It just shows you how seemingly separate structures are truly connected.
And that's often where the round ligament of the uterus ends its journey, right? It terminates right there in the tissue of the labia majus.
Absolutely, anchoring everything back to the trunk. Now, we move just a bit inward. We find some small but functionally huge players, the greater vestibular glands.
Commonly known as Bartholin's glands.
Exactly. Bartholin's glands. You can picture them flanking the vaginal opening roughly at the 5 and 7 o'clock positions.
So what's their main role beyond just lubrication?
Well, their importance is also in comparative anatomy. They are the direct structural homologs to the male bulbourethral glands. They may be tiny, maybe a centimeter, but they secrete a vital lubricating mucus during arousal.
And the clitoris is just a masterpiece of specialized tissue structurally. It's often misunderstood, but it shares a really clear structural plan with the male penis. It's mostly erectile tissue.
That's exactly right. You have to visualize it in three parts. The two crura, which attach deep to the ischiopubic
Okay.
the body, which has the two corpora cavernosa, and then the glans clitoris, which is just that highly sensitive exposed tip.
And there's more erectile tissue nearby too, right?
Yes, the bulbs of the vestibule. These are two elongated masses that flank the vaginal orifice, and they're covered by the bulbospongiosus muscle.
Okay, here's a really high-value piece of information for anyone interested in pain science. We always say the main nerve supply here is the pudendal nerve, from S2 to S4.
Right, that's the big one.
But where does it get more complicated?
It gets complicated right at the top. While the pudendal nerve is the main player, the anterior third of the labia majus actually gets its supply from the ilioinguinal nerve.
Which comes from way up at L1.
All the way up at L1. So if you have a patient with vulvodynia or generalized pain, knowing that subtle difference is absolutely vital, that small L1 branch changes your whole diagnostic approach.
That L1 versus S2, S4 distinction is exactly the kind of detail Grey's is famous for. Okay, let's move past the vulva and into the pathway itself. The vagina.
All right, so picture the vagina as a fibromuscular tube, and it's lined by a stratified epithelium, but its orientation is key.
It's not straight up and down.
No, not at all. It runs ascending posteriorly and superiorly. It creates this pronounced angle, usually 60 to 70 degrees, with a horizontal plane.
And that orientation matters for everything from instrument insertion to childbirth.
Absolutely.
And where the vagina meets the uterus, it forms this recess around the cervix, the vaginal fornix.
Yes, divided into anterior, posterior, and two lateral parts. And those lateral parts are our next huge surgical landmark.
They really are.
You have to visualize the path of the ureters. As they head toward the bladder, they pass incredibly close to those lateral parts of the fornix.
And here comes the rule you can never forget in an operating room.
Water under the bridge. The ureter passes under the uterine artery at this precise location. It is the classic anatomical danger zone.
And the consequences of getting that wrong during, say, a hysterectomy are massive.
Catastrophic. Injury to the ureter, the water, can lead to hydronephrosis, loss of the kidney, or urine leaking into the peritoneum. Visualizing that relationship is what allows surgeons to safely ligate the artery without compromising the ureter.
Okay, let's talk defense mechanisms. After puberty, the vaginal epithelium changes chemically.
It's biological genius, really. The epithelium starts producing huge amounts of glycogen,
Right.
and the resident bacteria, mainly Lactobacillus acidophilus, break that glycogen down into lactic acid. The result is a highly acidic environment. We're talking a pH of around 3.
3. That is profoundly acidic.
It is. It's a powerful chemical defense that inhibits the growth of almost all other harmful microorganisms.
So it's only when those glycogen levels drop, like before puberty or after menopause, that the system becomes more vulnerable.
Exactly.
Moving up to the upper genital tract, let's look at the uterus. It's positioned between the bladder and rectum, and it's surprisingly mobile, but there's a normal resting position, right?
Yes, and we define it with two terms, anteversion and anteflexion.
Okay, break those down.
Anteversion means the cervix tilts forward relative to the vagina, and anteflexion means the body of the uterus tilts forward relative to the cervix.
So it's kind of tucked forward over the bladder.
Precisely. Knowing that normal orientation helps you understand the abnormal, like a retroverted uterus.
And focusing on the cervix for a moment, the external os, the opening, can tell you a clinical story just by looking at it.
It really can. In someone who has never given birth, the os is typically circular.
And after childbirth,
It becomes a transverse slit. It's a permanent, visible marker of past parturition. And inside, the canal has these beautiful folds, the arbor vitae uteri, the tree of life.
now for the support system, Gray's makes a critical distinction that we have to emphasize. The difference between passive peritoneal folds and actual supportive connective tissue.
This is one of the biggest points of confusion. The broad ligaments are not supportive ligaments.
They're not.
No, they're just huge lateral folds of peritoneum that drape over the uterus and tubes. They create pockets, like the pouch of Douglas posteriorly, but they don't provide real support.
So if the broad ligaments are just drapes, what are the true heavy-duty support structures?
Those are the true visceral ligaments. They're dense condensations of endopelvic fascia. The critical ones are the uterosacral, pubocervical, and especially the cardinal ligaments.
McEnroth's ligaments.
Magenrod's ligaments, yes.
So how should we visualize those?
Picture the cervix as the central hub of a wheel. These ligaments are like thick, tough spokes radiating out from that hub, anchoring the cervix to the lateral pelvic walls. They are what prevent uterine prolapse.
And this brings us back to that surgical danger zone.
It does. The lower parts of the ureters and all the major pelvic blood vessels pass directly through this dense ligamentous tissue. It's that crowded intersection again.
It all comes together. Now, the uterine artery, it takes this really unusual coiled path up the side of the uterus. Why is it so tortuous?
The tortuosity is essential. It's to accommodate the massive change in size the uterus undergoes during pregnancy. It lets the vessel straighten out and increase its length without tearing.
A built-in feature for expansion.
Exactly. And from this artery, you get arcuate arteries, and then those dive deep.
And these deeper arteries are where the really specialized anatomy is.
They are. The arcuate arteries give rise to the highly coiled spiral arteries in the endometrium. We'll come back to them. But their behavior, their constriction and relaxation, is basically the switch that controls the entire menstrual cycle.
Okay, let's follow the path of the ovum through the uterine tubes. 4 segments, right?
4 segments. Starting from the uterus and moving out, you have the narrow isthmus, then the wide ampulla.
Which is the most common site for fertilization.
The most common site. Then you get the infundibulum, which flares out and ends in those little finger-like fimbriae that hover over the ovary.
And microscopically, the lining of those tubes is engineered for 2 main jobs.
2 jobs, 2 cell types. First, you have ciliated cells. Their cilia are always waving, creating a current that physically wafts the oocytes toward the uterus.
And the second type.
The secretory cells, or PEG cells, their job is to produce a nutrient-rich fluid to sustain the oocyte and also to help with capacitation for sperm.
Now for the ovaries themselves, they sit in the ovarian fossa, suspended by the mesovarium and the suspensory ligament of the ovary. Why is that ligament so critical to remember?
Because it's the highway for the vasculature. It contains the ovarian artery, the vein, and the nerves. It's not a major support, but it's the vital conduit.
And the ovary moves during pregnancy, right?
It does. It gets displaced superiorly until it's basically an abdominal organ by the 3rd trimester.
Inside the ovary, you've got the outer cortex with the follicles and the intervascular medulla. What's the key layer covering it all?
It's a tough collagenous layer called the tunica albuginea, and that's covered by a single layer of cuboidal cells, which is a bit of a misnomer. It's called the germinal epithelium.
All right, let's walk through the follicle's journey. Let's hit the key stages.
It starts as a primordial follicle, super simple, a single layer of flat cells around the oocyte.
And the next step?
The transition to the secondary stage. This is marked by 2 things. the formation of the zona pellucida, that thick envelope vital for fertilization, and the differentiation of the theca cell layers.
Then comes the antral stage.
Named for the antrum, that fluid-filled cavity that appears, and this is where the hormone factory really starts to ramp up.
How does it function as a hormone factory?
The theca interna cells produce androstenedione. This gets passed to the granulosa cells, which convert it into estrogen, mainly estradiol.
And that estrogen surge drives it to the final stage.
The Graafian, or pre-ovulatory follicle. This is where the primary oocyte finally completes its first meiotic division, getting ready for ovulation.
After ovulation, the leftover follicle transforms into the corpus luteum. What happens if fertilization doesn't occur?
If the egg isn't fertilized, the corpus luteum starts to regress after about 12 to 14 days. It stops producing progesterone, collapses, and becomes this dense, fibrous scar.
The corpus albicans.
The white body, exactly.
And that regression is the trigger for the entire menstrual cycle. The state of the endometrium is completely dictated by these ovarian hormones.
It is. The first phase is proliferative, driven by estrogen. The endometrium repairs and thickens, glands are straight.
And then progesterone takes over.
In the secretory phase, this is all about preparing for implantation. The glands become tortuous, they accumulate glycogen, and the lining reaches its max depth, maybe 6 millimeters.
And then the menstrual phase itself, which is a controlled, violent event, what physically triggers the shedding?
It's those spiral arteries we mentioned. When the corpus luteum dies, hormone levels plummet. This drop causes those specialized spiral arteries to constrict powerfully and then relax.
And that cuts off the blood supply.
Exactly. It leads to ischemia and necrosis, a controlled infarction, in that superficial layer of the endometrium, which causes it to detach and get expelled.
Okay, final dynamic system. Pregnancy. The uterus expands dramatically, but it's not just simple stretching.
No, the massive growth is mainly muscle hypertrophy and a huge increase in vascularity.
Yeah.
And functionally, the narrow isthmus of the uterus merges into the body to form the lower uterine segment.
And that segment is thinner and less contractile.
Far less contractile.
Which is a huge factor in modern surgery, isn't it?
It is. It makes it the preferred, safer site for a cesarean section incision. It bleeds less, and it's a thinner wall to get through.
We also have to mention the clinical risks associated with the placenta.
Absolutely. Beyond placenta previa, where it covers the os, you have the spectrum of abnormally invasive placentation.
Accreta, increta, and percreta.
Right. Accreta means it's invaded into the myometrium. Increta goes deeper into the muscle, and percreta goes all the way through the uterine wall.
And why is this becoming more common?
Because these conditions are strongly associated with a history of prior uterine surgery, especially past C-sections. They are incredibly high-risk situations because of the danger of hemorrhage.
Finally, let's wrap up with the mechanics of labor. During the second stage, the fetal head uses the levator ani to rotate. But the true life-saving event happens in the third stage.
That third stage, the expulsion of the placenta, is arguably the most critical for maternal safety. Once it detaches, those massive, crisscrossing muscle fibers of the myometrium have to contract immediately and forcefully.
They act like tourniquets.
Exactly, like biological tourniquets, clamping down on the exposed vessels to prevent fatal hemorrhage. And we should also mention the hormone relaxin is softening the pelvic joints to help make space.
That walkthrough really confirms the sheer complexity here. If we were to boil it down, what are the most critical structural relationships to remember?
I'd say 3 visualization points. First, differentiate the passive peritoneal folds from the truly supportive cardinal ligaments.
Okay.
Second, burn that surgical rule into your brain. The ureter passing under the uterine artery.
Water under the bridge.
Always. And third, understand that the entire menstrual cycle is physically driven by the behavior of those specialized spiral arteries.
It's a system that's designed for stability with those pelvic anchors, but it also has to have this massive biological plasticity for cycles and pregnancy. Just breathtaking engineering.
And that leads to a final thought for you to carry forward. Consider the constant balancing act the body performs. It has to maintain this robust, highly acidic protective environment in the vagina.
Right, to fight off pathogens.
But right next door, the uterus must be ready to become this incredibly receptive, specialized landscape for foreign tissue to implant. That constant negotiation between defense and acceptance is happening every single cycle.
A perfect biological riddle to ponder. We hope this deep dive has given you the clear anatomical map you needed. Keep exploring these foundational concepts.